In this video, I will be explaining the names of notes along with their value and their rest symbol. I'll also be explaining dotted notes. I'll be listing the notes on this side of the screen one by one. Although I'll be using the British note naming system in this video, I'll also list their American equivalent name. No system is better than the other, but you'll notice that the American names appear smaller. This is purely to save space on the screen. So let's start with a semibreve or whole note. As you can see from the far left-hand column, it looks very much like a small letter O. In fact, when you start to write music, it's often easier just to think of it as a small letter O. It has a value of 4. This is a minim and has a value of 2. It looks like a semibreve, but it has a stem, that little black line attached to it. As it has a value of 2, you'd need 2 minims to equal the value of 1 semibreve, which has the value of 4. Any note which has a stem, and we'll look at some more in a moment, it's very important to ensure that the stem is on the right if the note head is at the bottom, whereas the stem is placed on the left if the note head is at the top. This sounds like me being very picky, but it's very important. Here's a capital letter E. If I move the line to the other side, it looks very odd. In fact, it looks like the number 3. Not very helpful if you mean an E rather than a 3. The correct placement of the stem is just as important. All notes with stems follow this rule. This is a crotchet and has a value of 1. Notice how it looks like a minim, but the note head is all black. As it has a value of 1, you'd need 4 crotchets to equal the value of 1 semibreve. This is a quaver and has a value of half. Notice how it looks like a crotchet, but we've added a tail to the stem. Let's just take a moment to look a little more at tails. Here are 2 quavers, each with their tails, and I've highlighted one of the tails so you can be absolutely sure about what I'm referring to. When 2 quavers sit next to each other, and sometimes 3 or 4, the tails can often be glued together to look like this. This means there are still 2 quavers, and together they equal 1, because half plus a half equals 1. Now, there are some quite complex rules relating to joining of notes like these together. Musicians refer to the rules as beaming. I look at beaming in another video, so if you need some assistance, have a look there if you need to. So, as the quaver has a value of half, you'd need how many to equal the value of 1 semibreve? You'd need 8. As I mentioned earlier, the stem always sits on the right if the note head is at the bottom, and on the left if the note head is at the top. However, the tail always sits on the right. This would never be correct, as the tail is on the left. Finally, this is a semiquaver. Semi means half, so it literally means half a quaver. Half of a quaver would be a quarter. Notice how it looks like a quaver but has another tail added. When 4 semiquavers sit next to each other, and sometimes 2 or 3 semiquavers, the stems can be glued together to look like this. It's worth noting here that different notes with tails, like quavers and semiquavers, can often be joined or beamed together. This isn't always possible, and as I said earlier, I do look at beaming in another of my videos. However, so you understand what I mean by this, here is a quaver and 2 semiquavers. Because all of the notes have tails, they are often beamed together to look like this. Notice how they are beamed. They are all neatly joined together to form one group. This grouping would be incorrect because one of the tails of the final semiquaver is sticking out of the group of notes. This would also be incorrect because only the top line is joining all 3 notes. The second tail is not joined together. Anyway, before I bog you down with beaming, let's go back to the semiquavers themselves. As each semiquaver has a value of a quarter, you'd need 16 of them to equal the value of 1 semibreve. When trying to learn note names and their values, it's always worth building a pyramid like this so you can see exactly how each note splits into other notes. If you need to, pause this video or rewind it to help you learn these notes. Now, you can see that from our list on the left, there is no note listed here which represents a value of 3. Well, such a note does exist, and it looks like this. It's called a dotted minim. Notice how it looks like a minim, but it's got a dot after it, hence why it's called a dotted minim. The dot is very important. Let me explain. When a dot is on the right-hand side of a note, it means add half of the note value to itself. This sounds complicated, but it is fairly straightforward. This note, without the dot, is a minim and worth 2. If we add a dot, the dot says add another half of the minim to the total value. So half a minim is 1. Therefore, a minim add 1 equals 3. A dotted minim equals 3. Before I go any further, just be aware that the dot must be to the right-hand side of a note. Don't get confused with a dot which is under or above the note head, as this means staccato, which means play the note short or detached. A dot can be added to any note. This is a crotchet, it's worth 1. If we add a dot, it means add half the value of a crotchet. Half the crotchet is half. Therefore, the value of this note is 1.5. Let's have a quick look at a dotted quaver. We already know that a quaver equals half. The dot adds half of that value. Half of a half is a quarter. So we add that quarter to the half. The total value is 3/4. So remember, a dot adds half of the value of the note to itself. Therefore, to have a note which equals a value of 3, we add a dot to a minim, a dotted minim. Finally, let's have a look at rests. A rest is a symbol that tells the musician to stop playing for a specific time or value. For example, perhaps a composer of a piece for clarinet and piano wants the clarinet to stop playing for the value of a crotchet, or maybe even an entire bar. Music contains symbols which represent silence for a specific value. The rest symbol for a crotchet, which has a value of 1, is this, and you can see that I've added it to the column called rest. And we call it a crotchet rest. So a crotchet equals 1, but if a composer wanted a musician to be silent for a value of 1, they would write this symbol. Now, I often get asked what's the easiest way to write a crotchet rest, as it does look a little complex. Well, it takes a little bit of practice, but my advice is to, firstly, draw a little Z, or Z if you prefer. Secondly, add a little loop to the bottom. Okay, it doesn't look anything special, but if you draw it neatly, it will be clear that you're drawing a crotchet rest. Always be careful when drawing notes and rests on a stave. This is too big, this is too small. The crotchet rest fits nicely like this on the stave. A quaver rest looks like this, a little 7 with a blob at the start of the symbol. Like the quaver, it's worth half. A semiquaver rest looks similar to a quaver rest. Remember that a quaver has 1 tail, so the quaver rest has 1 arm. A semiquaver has 2 tails, so its rest has 2 arms. So this symbol represents a rest of a quarter. Now, the rest for a minim, semibreve and dotted minim look very similar. Let's look at the minim rest first. It's a little black rectangle which I've put onto a stave, those 5 lines. 2 very important things to notice here. Number 1, the black rectangle sits on the line. And secondly, it sits on the middle line and not any other line. The reason these 2 things are important becomes clear if we now look at the semibreve rest. We use the same little black rectangle, but notice how this time it hangs from the line rather than sits like the minim rest. And secondly, it hangs from the line above where the minim rest sits. A semibreve rest will only ever hang from the line which I've highlighted in red. An important feature of the semibreve rest is that it also represents a full bars rest in almost every other time signature. There are a few exceptions, but if you see this, it means either a 4-beat rest or a whole bars rest. The dotted minim rest looks like a minim rest but has a dot next to it. The dot works in exactly the same way as it does with a note. It adds half the value of the rest to itself. In other words, the black rectangle sitting on the line is a rest worth 2. The dot adds half of that value to itself, 1. So 2 plus 1 equals 3. Dots can be added to other rest symbols. Here's our crotchet rest, which is worth 1. If we add a dot next to it, 1 plus half of its own value, a half, equals 1.5. Now you might ask, why have a dotted crotchet rest when you could just have a crotchet rest and then a quaver rest instead? Well, yes, you can, but there are some very complicated rules about the use of rest, and I do cover them in another of my videos. For the moment, just be sure that you understand that dots can be added to rests as well as notes. So before we finish, just a reminder, you must learn these notes, their names, their values, and their rest symbol. Secondly, if it helps to remember the value of notes, draw a pyramid like I did earlier. Thirdly, a dot next to a note or a rest adds half the value of the note or rest value to itself. So here's a quaver rest, which is worth half. Add a dot, it becomes 3/4. As half, add half of itself, a quarter, becomes 3/4. I do hope this video has been useful to you. Many thanks for watching.